So I first watched Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining in a tiny cabin in New Hampshire where there was no service on this tiny little box TV with a couple of friends in the middle of winter. Suffice it to say, it was one of the best film experiences I've ever had. Fast forward just about a year and I'm about to begin my junior year of college, and for whatever reason I randomly stumbled upon this album called An Empty Bliss Beyond This World by the Caretaker the night before my junior year is about to begin. And I don't know what happened to me. I don't know what clicked, but in that moment began a lifelong obsession with music that transports you to that haunted ballroom from The Shining. Not all of it is overt. I have become obsessed with British dance band music from the 30s and similar like loungy music from the 40s and 50s. Jazz and vocal jazz just feels like someone is singing to you from their piano from across the room. I've also become obsessed with music that's not quite that exact era, but just feels like it's from another time, distorted through time, fuzzy and hazy, and haunting as if the music itself is trying to take your soul and bring it elsewhere. So in this video, I want to talk to you about some of my favorite albums and artists that evoke that feeling of being in the haunted ballroom, or just feel like you are being haunted through time. I think the two key things to music like this are the haunting and the nostalgia, so without further ado, here are some albums, artists, songs that will get you in either the Halloween spirit or the nostalgic spirit, or just some good fucking music. Up first, I have to talk about An Empty Bliss Beyond This World by The Caretaker and pretty much all of The Caretaker's music. An Empty Bliss Beyond This World is an ambient album that takes British dance band songs from the 30s and has distorted them in terrifying ways. Leland Kirby, who is the Caretaker, his music is very much about and inspired by memory loss and nostalgia, and times long gone. His first few albums, like The Caretaker is not just like randomly chosen. His first few albums especially were directly inspired by The Shining. I think his first album might be called like Selected Works from the Haunted Ballroom, something like that. So like this isn't just like a random connection. His music really is an homage, or at least began as an homage to that scene from The Shining. And first off, I think the samples that he chose are amazing. There are Russ Morgan and Al Bowley tunes. I've been able to like find some of these songs through my travels and like I've heard the originals, and what he does to them in slowing them down and adding these effects and these layers really gives you this sense that like this music is from another time and the music itself has come back to haunt me. A lot of the Caretaker's more recent music has been specifically focused on memory loss and dementia, and I think you see the seeds of that interest in this album, because like why would you be interested in music from another time but the distortion of it and the way that we remember it if you weren't interested in memory? I think it sounds incredible. I hear the criticisms up, down, left, and right that like it's not even his music. If you like this music, just go listen to Russ Morgan, and I'm here to tell you, you can both listen to Russ Morgan and listen to An Empty Bliss Beyond This World and get completely different experiences from both. Up next we have Badlands by Dirty Beaches. This is a lo-fi experimental rock album from 2011, and this doesn't give me like the 30s like ballroom vibes, it more gives me Elvis vibes. This really does feel like an homage to the 50s in a certain way. It has that rockabilly flair to it, and like the Ronettes are sampled in one of the songs, and like it just has that kind of like, not tropical, but you know how Elvis kind of has like a Hawaiian thing going on in some of his songs? There just seems to be that kind of rockabilly twang going on in these songs, but again, the music is distorted. It feels like it has been transported through time. One of the things I love about this album is while there are a couple songs that like do feel more like regular songs that have been sampled, a lot of the stuff surrounding that is just more like explicitly kind of horrifying. There's this one song called Hotel that's just like very spooky sounds, or the first song, what's that called, like Speedway King or something, is just like really horrifying, almost like harsh soundscapes with like these harsher vocals on top, and like I think this is one of those albums that I prefer to listen to as a full product. And yeah, if I do listen to one of the individual songs, it's gonna be one of those ones that's a little bit more melodious, but as like a full product, I think this evokes something very particular, something that I'm just really into. Next we have an album that I talked about in a recent video, and that is By the Sea and Other Solitary Places by Annabel Lee. This is a dark jazz, vocal jazz album that I've seen someone once describe as like Billie Holiday live at the Overlook Hotel. This one really does feel like that hotel, that smoke-filled lounge vibe but of course distorted through these layers of haziness that make it feel scary and horrifying. For some reason, I'm not even sure I'm gonna be able to articulate. I think the female vocals on this almost give it like a witchy vibe. Like I saw someone refer to this as like vivid and incantory, as if like a spell is being cast on me, and I definitely experience that when I'm listening to this album. Her vocal performance is so almost gentle, and yet like the way the music around it is constructed is not gentle at all. Again, it feels like I am being hypnotized, a spell is being put on me, and I'm letting it. I'm really letting it. I think what helps for this album is kind of the mystery behind it. I don't think I can find any biographical information about Annabel Lee. There's the vaguest of information on their Bandcamp, but even then, like, it's not like, let's go to Annabel Lee's Instagram or whatever and see what they're up to. It's just, there's kind of almost a haunting vibe around the existence of the album itself. And I do like that this album is explicitly jazzy, because I think one of the things I kind of look for with this whole atmosphere is a jazz element at times, and this certainly has that. Next we have Act of Tenderness by Cindy Lee. This is a noise pop, hypnagogic pop album that I think is a little bit more unsettling than explicitly scary or spooky. I re-listened to this one last night, and it's definitely noisy and harsher than a lot of the other ones on this album, where it doesn't create kind of like an atmosphere of like a lounge or whatever. It's kind of like it has elements of brill building music. I think the reason why this album's on this list at all is because it does evoke a certain nostalgia in me, but I think it's more interested in just unsettling its listeners than anything else. Cindy Lee's vocal performance in this feels very far away. It feels very fuzzy. You know, like that Tumblr trend of like music from another room that I was very into back in the day? This kind of has elements of that, of like, this music is happening in another room, and whatever's happening on top of that, like whatever's happening in the room I'm in is scarier than what's happening in the other room. Cindy Lee is still making music. This came out a few years ago, and her album from last year was one of my favorite albums of 2020, so she is an artist I will definitely be keeping tabs on, because I like what she's going for. Next I have an album that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that is Floating into the Night by Julee. This is an ambient pop, dream pop album, and this is definitely a bit of a departure from the first four albums that I think are intentionally distorted music to create an effect, and this I think just has like a very smoke-filled lounge atmosphere to it inherently. I will not lie, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this music is very integral to Twin Peaks. This album has floating and rocking back inside your heart and falling in it, which is the the theme to Twin Peaks, and I think Twin Peaks kind of has that mix of nostalgia and haunting going on with the show as well. So there may be a great deal of association with this music, but I also think the reason why this music is so perfect for Twin Peaks is because it gives off that, you know, like, I am sitting in a lounge or a ballroom and someone is singing to me, but something's not quite right. There's still something kind of hazy and unsettling about the compositions. Julee Cruz's voice is so beautiful and so ethereal, it almost feels like I'm on a different plane. Maybe not like I'm traveling through time, but traveling through space in certain ways. So this is just music for the ballroom, or for the lounge. I don't know if it's necessarily a certain place in time, but it is definitely music that I want to like be in this smoke-filled haze of horror. That's what I want when I listen to this album. Finally, I have one more album I want to talk about in like this first category. I'm gonna go into some other stuff later, but the first, like, there's 6 key albums I want to talk about, and the last one I want to talk about is Felt Mountain by Goldfrapp. This is a down-tempo ambient pop album that I almost feel like is for like the haunted circus more than anything else, but I think the circus can kind of translate in some ways to the ballroom. Like, it's not circus and like it's wacky or whatever, but like there are certain musical flourishes in this that just feel like, I feel like there's like sliding elements. I'm totally unsure how actually to describe how, like, the instrumentation of this album, but there's a certain dark whimsy to this album that I think creates that nostalgic element. I think circuses are kind of a nostalgic thing, that's why it's looped in with all these things, but also it's very nocturnal and very hazy and very spooky in its own right. This is one of my favorite nighttime albums in general. I feel like it's got so much life to it, but again, in dark ways. I feel like I don't know how to describe dark life and dark liveliness, but it feels spooky, it feels unsettling, like again, something's not quite right. But there's also, I think, a bit more of like an upbeat, even though it's like down tempo or whatever, like there's just a bit more movement to this album that I think more of like the ambient, atmospheric elements of some of the other ones I've mentioned. So the next 4 albums I want to talk about is music from those time periods. A lot of this music was made, you know, recently, evoking a past time, and sometimes you don't need the haunting element, you just want the ballroom element. So I want to talk about 4 albums that like when I listen to, I feel the nostalgia because it actually is music from the 30s, 40s, 50s. First, if you are a fan of The Caretaker at all, I cannot recommend enough. I think it's like the collected works of Russ Morgan by Russ Morgan and his orchestra, which is a lot of just random songs by Russ Morgan and his orchestra, who is one of the most frequently sampled artists by The Caretaker. Not every song on this is a hit, and I'll admit, I think some of the songs that I ended up loving most from this collection were ones I'd previously heard in An Empty Bliss Beyond This World or other Caretaker projects, but it's very like fulfilling to hear the original songs and to be able to like picture myself transported in the way that it was actually happening. In ways it makes me appreciate The Caretaker's music more, because it's clear that what Kirby was doing was not just like recreating these songs, but creating an entirely different experience. He was creating the experience of remembering music, and now I get to hear the music that he was creating the experience of remembering. Jesus Christ, what a sentence. But overall, I think it's just a very good compilation of music from that time. I've found it very difficult to find actual like albums of music from that time. I've heard just like a lot of random singles, but this is a pretty good compilation. Jumping forward, I could not make this video without talking about Nina Simone, who is my favorite vocal jazz artist, one of my favorite artists just of all time, and I would specifically like to talk about Pastel Blues. Pastel Blues is Nina Simone and her piano playing the most beautiful music of all time. Nina Simone's voice continues to move me no matter what she's singing, and I personally think this is just her best work ever. This isn't music to dance to. This and the next few are more like smoke-filled lounge music than anything else. Like this, I can picture myself sipping on, I don't know, a whiskey sour or something, or maybe just a straight whiskey, let's be honest here, while Nina is singing to me and like I'm crying softly at my, like through my crystal glass. I have very specific fantasies. And while there is obviously the atmospheric and the aesthetic elements of this album for me, it is also just, I could not talk about this album without talking about how important this is just politically. Her performances of the last 2 songs in this album, Strange Fruit and Sinner Man, are just like 2 of the most important songs I feel like in history. I don't want to be sipping whiskey when I'm listening to Strange Fruit. I want to be bowing down for just like her raw performance of this song that is such an important racial and political commentary. It's just, it's brilliant on pretty much every single level. Then closing us out, I'm actually going to talk about them together because I feel like I have the same thoughts about both of these albums. We have Chet Baker Sings by Chet Baker and Blossom Dearie by Blossom Dearie. These are both traditional pop albums of someone at the piano singing some standards, and I just love both of them. Chet Baker is obviously just like an icon. I think his versions of certain songs, Hold On a Moment, his version of My Funny Valentine, I feel like is the version of My Funny Valentine, but I feel like so much else on this album is also wonderful. His version of I Get Along Without You Very Well is like absolutely emotionally destructive. And then Blossom Dearie is a little bit more upbeat. Blossom Dearie, I also kind of want to dance to. There's not like a twee element to this, but like there is a liveliness to this. It's a little less forlorn. It's a little, like Chet Baker's for when you're out of love and Blossom Dearie is for when you're in love. I find Blossom Dearie for summertime and I find Chet Baker for wintertime, maybe is how I would put it. And I did listen to a lot of Blossom Dearie this summer, which might be why it's on the mind. But I just find both of these such like delicious albums of like just someone at their piano singing some of the greatest songs of all time, and like their versions of these songs are just amazing. Finally, to close us out, I want to tell you some specific songs that evoke this vibe. If you're really so far into this that you're like, I need to listen to everything Nicole's mentioning, let me just tell you some songs. And this is all going to be in the description in case just like you don't want to fucking take down notes. So Al Bowley is another person who was in the British dance band scene, and a lot of his songs were sampled by The Caretaker and are also just amazing. So we've got, oh Christ, Midnight, The Stars and You, What Do You Know About Love, It's All Forgotten Now, and The Very Thought of You. Those are my 4 favorites. You have Nightmare by Artie Shaw, which is nice and dark and hazy. You You have Stardust by Hoagy Carmichael, which I feel like also kind of associate those two songs in my head for some reason. I'm a little less familiar with Ella Fitzgerald than I'd like to be. It's why one of her albums isn't on this list, but Dream a Little Dream of Me is one of my favorite songs of all time. Her version of that with Louis Armstrong is just like out of this world incredible. You have the Platters, who are like a doo-wop group, a traditional pop group. Twilight Time and Smoke Gets in Your Eyes are two of the greatest songs just of all time ever. Then you have just some straight up jazz songs. Sidney Bechet is, I think, shit, what does he play? Like the soprano clarinet or something? It's something I've never heard of. But his version of Summertime, the Gershwin classic, is one of my favorite songs of all time. And then also this year I've gotten really into the song It Never Entered My Mind by Miles Davis, that I feel like also is like nice and hazy in those right ways. Also his song Roundabout Midnight from his first album really fits this vibe. There's so much more, but like I can't just sit here and tell you about songs because what would be the point of that? So I'm just gonna close this out there. I hope you've gotten some good music recommendations. I think a lot of the albums in the first half of this video are perfect for October because they're spooky and they're dark and they just feel right. If you've encountered anything in your life that you think gives you this vibe, whether it be music, books, movies, because there are other mediums. I think The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, the book, fits this vibe. I think in a weird way, Eyes Wide Shut almost does. Just like, I don't know, like the idea of like masquerade, even though there's obviously weird sex stuff going on in that movie, like there's an element of like, big room, it's ornate, everyone's wearing masks, huh? So that's kind of here. Obviously a lot of Twin Peaks stuff I feel like fits this vibe because Smoke-Filled Lounge literally like in the show. But if there's literally anything that you think has that nice combination of nostalgia and a ballroom that you would like to recommend to me, please recommend it to me because I will consume it voraciously. I'm gonna be listening to An Empty Bliss Beyond This World like the second it turns dark tonight. So thank you so much for watching this silly little video, and you will see me in the next one.